It was a damp, chilly morning in the middle of September 1916 in northern France, outside the village of Pozières. Heavily laden British assault troops were making their way forward to the start of the line for a new attack on German positions. The Battle of the Somme had been underway since July that year, with heavy casualties on both sides. As they trudged along the side of the road, they came across very large, square objects covered in tarpaulin that dwarfed the men. When they inquired about them, they were told that the boxes were simply tanks, water tanks who would provide drinking water for the attacking soldiers. A few days later, these tanks were revealed as a new secret weapon, intended to help achieve a breakthrough and open up the front line to a British advance. They were angular mechanical vehicles, powered by caterpillar tracks and encased in bulletproof metal. They mounted viewing ports at the front and a small gun turret on each side. Their first use in battle gave a good representation of the strengths and weaknesses of this new weapon of war. The Germans were taken by surprise, shocked by their encounter and unclear how they could oppose this noisy beast. Many gave way and retreated in disorder, holding open the prospect of significant advances for the British infantry following up behind. Although armed resistance to the tanks was limited, a combination of mechanical failures and difficult terrain, including mud, trenches, and shell holes, saw most of the tanks struggling to maneuver. Indeed, most of the tanks broke down before they had even been able to cross the designated start line of the attack. From this limited and tentative beginning, what we know as the tank, or perhaps the main battle tank in modern terminology, has been with us for over 100 years. Tank designs and weapon systems designed specifically to destroy the tank have been involved in an evolutionary battle ever since. In fact, when the first German field artillery piece in 1916 was leveled into a flat trajectory and pointed at a lumbering British tank, it seems as if someone somewhere has regularly been predicting the death of the tank as a weapon of war. Now, in the first and second decades of the 21st century, anti-tank technologies have made some very rapid advances. In 2020, armored battles between the armies of Armenia and Azerbaijan seem to demonstrate very starkly the serious vulnerabilities of the main battle tanks to new aerial weapon systems, drones, and missiles. In November 2021, with Russian tanks already building up in significant numbers on the Ukrainian border, the then British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, stood up in the British Parliament to declare, "We have to recognize that the old concepts of fighting big tank battles on European landmass are over, and there are other, better things we should be investing in FCAS, in the Future Combat Air System, in cyber. This is how warfare in the future is going to be." Well, yes and no. Now, as social media is awash with pictures of exploding tanks across the muddy steppes of Ukraine, many analysts, experts, and soldiers are now wondering whether finally the tank, this powerful symbol of military and national power, has finally reached the end of its use. But before we look at where the tank might be going, let's just remind ourselves where it's been. The tank was designed as a means of breaking the trench, barbed wire, and artillery deadlock on the battlefields of northern France. The technology was new and weak, and the concept was uncertain. No one really knew how best to deploy them. Early tanks were slow, prone to breakdowns, and could only be expected to achieve local and limited tactical objectives. But by the end of the First World War, the concept had been very much proven. The 1920s and 30s saw rapid advances in the design, capability, and tactics of this new military dimension. It was in the 1940s when the tank, together with other mechanized and armored supporting units, infantry, artillery, engineers, effectively showed the arrival of large-scale armored warfare as a means of deciding conflicts and winning wars. Although tank formations could have grand strategic impact, with a handful of panzer divisions, you could even conquer entire countries. Anti-tank technology was endeavoring to keep up. Artillery developed specialized anti-tank guns and projectiles with an increasingly higher velocity that could punch holes in the armor. The infantry dispensed with weak anti-tank rifles and moved on to handheld missile launchers such as the Panzerfaust and the bazooka, and the air forces experimented with cannons, rockets, and missiles. During the Cold War, from the early 1950s to the end of the 1980s, the great powers continued to develop large-scale, increasingly modern, tank-based armies. Technological developments came thick and fast: infrared night vision, nuclear, biological, and chemical protection, digitized communications and information sharing, computerized command and control, stabilized guns, and reactive armor. Many armies measured their military capabilities by the number of tanks they possessed, and they looked impressive when they were lined up and driving past a dictator for a victory parade. But the tank has never been invulnerable. Operating inside a tank in a small crew of 3 or 4 people is to be cut off from the outside world. Visibility and information is limited. Tanks with restrictive vision ports have to move very cautiously in forests, urban areas, and at night. If the enemy infantry had the courage to get close up, it was still absolutely possible to damage or destroy a tank with a well-placed grenade or even the humble petrol bomb. Many tanks in combat are abandoned rather than knocked out, often because the crew do not know what's going on and fear an attack they cannot see coming. In the First World War, artillery, machine guns, and primitive anti-tank rifles could damage and destroy a tank. In the 1940s, it was the bazooka, Piat, or Panzerfaust. Some tanks started to wrap additional skirts of armor around themselves. Another major anti-tank development proved itself: the guided missile. During the 1973 Yom Kippur Arab-Israeli War, many portable anti-tank guided missile systems were used very effectively against Israeli tank units. The missile was a Soviet-designated AT-3 Saga, brought onto the battlefield in an average-sized suitcase. It was the first wire-guided anti-tank missile to be used in large numbers. The Saga reportedly accounted for 25% of Israeli tank losses. The missile had a long range. US assessments at the time were that at 2 miles distance, the Saga had a 60% chance of destroying the M60, America's most modern tank for the time. The arrival of the Saga was a shock to the Israeli army and the world. Commentators and analysts at the time declared that the era of the tank was now over, and really, it seems as if people have been predicting the death of the tank every 10 years. But they're still around. In 1990, Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, invaded neighboring Kuwait with a heavy tank force. A US-led military coalition was assembled in the region, preparing, if diplomacy would fail, to force the Iraqi army out. In January 1991, Operation Desert Storm got underway and saw hundreds of American, British, and other Allied tanks and mechanized vehicles punch their way into Iraqi territory in a classic and very successful armored maneuver war. The expensive American M1 Abrams, in particular, proved its worth. At the Battle of 73 Eastings, small numbers of technologically advanced American tanks engaged with and defeated dozens of Iraqi-owned Soviet-built tanks. The tank had proved two things simultaneously: just how effective and potent it could be, and also just how easily high-tech weapons of war could be turned into flaming chunks of wreckage. In 2003, another war in the Gulf also showed how effective highly mobile tank forces could be when offered flat open surfaces over which to operate. But this time, a mechanized coalition force did not fare so well once the battle had moved into dense urban areas. The old problems identified thousands of times during the Second World War were brought to the fore. Tanks found it hard to see around corners. They could not spot individuals armed with rocket-propelled grenades creeping up on them. If the tank commander did sit up with his hatch open to get a better view, he was likely to be shot. American M1 designers rushed to create additional protective upgrade packages for their tanks. But the tank still remains a major symbol of power, almost a show of state identity if you think of all the military parades where tanks feature prominently: Russia, North Korea, India, and China. It's hard to imagine a fleet of drones having the same visual impact. Vladimir Putin's 2023 May Day victory parade in Moscow was laughed at because he could only muster one tank outside the Kremlin because of the high losses his armored forces were suffering in Ukraine. At the moment, it seems as if anti-tank technologies are advancing rapidly and are now posing greater challenges for the tank. In 2020, a sharp series of clashes between the forces of Armenia and Azerbaijan over the contested region of Nagorno-Karabakh provided a lot of video footage of tanks being destroyed by aerial drones and missiles. Exaggerated claims of tank losses made it hard to see what was really going on, but it did seem clear that large numbers of slow-moving tanks were being knocked out with ease. This prompted a flood of predictions, once again, of the death of the tank. However, the relatively small actions in Nagorno-Karabakh were placed in a totally different perspective when Russian armored forces launched a full-scale, special military operation to invade Ukraine. Suddenly, social media was flooded with dramatic, close-up and high-quality footage of exploding Russian tanks, self-propelled artillery, armored personnel carriers, and other assorted armored vehicles. To all observers, it was clear that Russian tank forces were suffering massive losses on the battlefield, likely in the thousands of vehicles. And Ukrainian armored units were also suffering substantial losses. By early 2024, large-scale Russian and Ukrainian tank operations seem to have come to a halt, and the battlefield has become a stalemate. Putting your armored vehicles at the tip of an attack no longer seems to end up in blitzkrieg-style triumph. So what's going on? Well, let's look at the sort of anti-tank threats that are now facing tanks on the modern battlefield. It's a mix of new and old challenges. The first thing we could say is that this is the first time that two relatively advanced armies have fought at such a large scale and tempo for decades. It's proving a painful learning curve for both armies in a brutal arena, with the whole world watching and hoping to learn some of the lessons. On the new side, handheld anti-tank guided missiles have slowly improved in capability. Systems like the American Javelin, introduced into service in 1996, and the NLAW New Generation Light Anti-Tank Weapon, a British anti-tank weapon, are fire-and-forget systems, allowing soldiers to quickly get into cover once they've been launched. And these missiles no longer rush in a straight line to hurl themselves against the thickest frontal armor a tank has to offer. No, they've been programmed to zoom high above the enemy target and strike down on the more thinly armored top of the turret. Multiple different kinds of precision-guided missiles, PGMs, dropped by aircraft or fired from artillery pieces, are able to strike tanks more accurately and from a greater distance. The Russo-Ukraine war has also become synonymous with the harnessing of remote-controlled unmanned aerial vehicles and drones, which can be flown directly against any perceived vulnerable part of the tank, striking with incredible precision. Tanks have always been vulnerable to attack from the sides, the rear, and above. Some drones have been made quickly and cheaply with rocket-propelled grenades strapped to cheap commercial quadcopters. Other, more professional versions, such as the Turkish TB2 Bayraktar, were used extensively at the start of the Russian invasion and proved deadly. They were so popular with the Ukrainian soldiers that they made a pop song about the Bayraktar. This combination of weapon systems are wreaking havoc among Russian armored units, and also to a lesser extent Ukrainian forces. On top of this, mines and concrete obstacles have further caused the tempo of operations to slow almost to a halt. In addition, small, cheap, and light drones are everywhere on the battlefield, making movement, camouflage, and concealment highly problematic. Small wonder that the front line has ground to a halt in trench warfare, very reminiscent of the First World War. The destructive power of the anti-tank weapon systems highlights a bigger problem. This is not just about the tank. If the tanks can be readily knocked by a $500 drone, the risks are surely even greater for all the other, less well-protected, armored and non-armored vehicles that are needed to operate on the battlefield. We do not know how many tanks and armored vehicles have been destroyed on both sides during this war, but it's certainly well into the thousands. So if the tank can no longer offer speed, protection, mobility, and offensive punch, well, what is it good for? Western military commanders have rushed to the defense of the tank, arguing that at the very least, fragile flesh-and-blood humans will always need some form of mobile armored protection in order to operate on a battlefield. When looking at the sheer scale of Russian tank losses, there is much criticism that can be directed at Russian tank design, Russian tactics, and Russian training. Russian forces have proven very poor at conducting combined arms operations, where tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support are closely coordinated. Russian forces do make good use of intelligence, reconnaissance, or air defense assets and simply send unprepared units in a column straight down a road where their movements can be anticipated and fired upon. What's more, most Russian tank designs have a significant flaw. They are built lower to the ground than Western tanks. Although this gives them an advantage in that they can be harder to spot, the compromise over size means they do not have a fourth crewman, and instead have an automatic loader system which runs a carousel of shells just underneath the commander and gunner crew positions. This makes the tank, the T-72 in particular, very vulnerable to a strike on the turret. Unlike in Western tanks such as the M1 Abrams, the crew are not protected from internal explosions. There's a lot of footage from Ukraine that demonstrates the end result of this design flaw, showing catastrophic explosions as tank turrets are hurled dozens of yards into the air. The Western military experts seem to be coming down in favor of the tank as a still relevant and potent force on the battlefield. But it has to be used intelligently and in combination with other forces, reconnaissance, infantry, artillery, and aircraft. U.S. Army Chief of Staff General James McConville said at a press conference in October 2022 that you don't need armor if you don't want to win. And it's notable that the Ukrainians are still calling for tanks. They are putting armored vehicles in the form of M1 Abrams, British Challengers, German Leopards, and M2 Bradleys, along with F-16s, at the top of their shopping list. And tactics are evolving incrementally. The tank is less likely to be at the head of a massed charge of heavy armor, but can be used further back, firing at longer range against command posts or bunkers. The Ukrainian forces love the British Challenger tank. Although it's rather heavy and has a tendency to get bogged down during the muddy seasons, its highly accurate 120mm gun serves as a sniper rifle to take out Russian positions at a distance of 4 or 5 kilometers. The consensus seems to be that the tank is not obsolete, but it does very much need to adapt, in terms of tactics and design, to the latest developments on the battlefield, particularly from what has been shown in Ukraine. One example is the problem caused to tanks by drones, which are fast, hard to spot, and can specifically target the most vulnerable parts of the tank. Russian efforts to guard against this have seen the arrival of cope cages, metal screens designed to intercept a missile before it impacts. They do not seem to have been very effective. So what options are there for reinventing the tank? Many students of warfare sense that we are reaching a tipping point in technological and tactical developments that could be on a scale resembling the arrival of the tank as a weapon of war at the beginning of the last century. There are quite a few ideas floating around with regard to the future tank. Let's take a look. The battlefield of the future is likely to be a much deadlier environment, with robots, drones, and missiles that can travel much further and for longer. It will see a higher number of remote-controlled vehicles that can operate on air, sea, and land. As well as the aerial anti-tank drones that are now so familiar, we've also seen Ukrainian remote-controlled naval drones sinking numerous Russian ships and small vehicles on land, driving across country to detonate against a key bridge or a Russian infantry position. But this does not mean that humans will simply vanish from the battlefield, but they might be further back, in command and control roles, while air, sea, and land drones form the first wave of an attack. In an era of AI, hacking, and jamming, it seems that a priority will be given to good communications networks if fleets of unmanned systems are to be directed without falling out of the sky. Some thinking is focusing on dividing the functions of a tank into separate systems, perhaps with a human crew in a command vehicle behind a screen of uncrewed vehicles that conduct reconnaissance, operate air and land sensors, and engage in combat. Here, the humans will still need to be in a protected vehicle capable of operating across a range of difficult terrain by day or night, and with weapon systems to protect themselves. Some drones might themselves be in control of groups of other remote-controlled systems. As regards weapons, a powerful 120mm gun is still effective at defeating tanks, infantry, and defensive positions. But missiles are also now increasingly being fired from tank guns, and laser weapons are being designed. There's much potential for tanks to carry loitering munitions, drones and guided bombs that can be fired and forgotten, left to hover over the battlefield for a longer period of time, waiting to locate and strike targets. Here's what it all boils down to. No system is perfect, but right now it's safe to say tanks as we know them aren't going anywhere anytime soon. True, the tank has had problems ever since it was invented. Ever since 1916, humans have been trying to work out ways to destroy them. Tanks cannot operate on their own. It still seems clear that successful military operations depend on cooperation between different weapon systems, tanks, infantry, artillery, air support, as well as good planning, training, and morale. But tactics and designs must also keep up, according to the new battlefield environment, which is increasingly full of robots, drones, missiles, and smart bombs. However, operating through remote control is not always easy, accurate, or reliable. Human crew members in tanks will still be vital for assessing situations based on sight, smell, sound, and experience. There is no sign in the US, Russia, or China that tanks are to be phased out. There is still much scope for upgrades. Dependable platforms such as the veteran, combat-proven M1 Abrams has shown that it can still hold its own. But main battle tanks cannot get much heavier. Many roads and bridges struggle to cope with more than 60 tons. But there's a lot of potential in active defensive measures, such as jammers and laser dazzlers. Drones may now have the technological advantage, but who knows how long it might last. Other tank designs such as the Russian T-14 and new American research are looking at the potential offered by unmanned turrets, which would make the tank a smaller target and offer better crew protection. So there are a lot of new ideas for updating and adapting the tank, and the conclusion seems to be that militaries will still need mobile armored protection in order to safely move the frail human body around the battlefield. We think the tank still very much has a future. Its vulnerabilities have recently been exposed, particularly in the Russo-Ukraine war, but this does not mean that the era of the tank is over. But what do you think? When Vladimir Putin wins the Russian 2030 presidential election, will we see him taking the salute at the May Victory Parade to a fleet of shiny new T-14 tanks, or would it be a massed swarm of quadcopters? Where do you think the tank is headed? Let us know in the comments. Now go and check out why Russia sucks at using tanks, or click this other video instead.